The idea had been sitting in the back of my mind since the first day I walked into Tae-ho's forge and watched him beat a bar of iron into a bracket that could have been poured in a fraction of the time. You can't whittle an engine block out of a bar. The geometry alone defeats you. The hollow chambers, the branching passages, the interior walls that no chisel can reach from outside. But you can pour one if you have a mold shaped like its hollows. That's casting. That's what the foundry is for. I explained it to them the way my grandfather had explained it to me, standing in the doorway of his restoration shop with a cracked pump housing in one hand and a cup of cold tea in the other. The principle is simple enough to say in a single breath: make a void in the exact shape of the part you want, then fill the void with molten iron. What comes out, once the iron cools and the mold is broken away, is the part. The difficulty is in everything the simple sentence leaves out. Mok Jae understood it faster than anyone. He had been a woodworker before he became a toolmaker, and the moment I described the pattern, the wooden replica the iron would copy, something behind his eyes went very still and focused, the way it did when he was measuring a fit by touch. "I carve it in wood first," he said, turning a half-finished block over in his hands, "and the iron copies the wood exactly." He set the block down on the bench and looked at it for a moment. "The part's already real, it's just wooden for now." That was exactly right. The pattern is the part's first life. Everything downstream, the mold, the pour, the casting, is just the process of making that wooden life permanent in iron. Cho Yeong ran the molding floor. She had come to the foundry the same way she came to everything, by watching until she understood the ratio, then working until her hands knew it without her having to think. Green sand, a mixture of fine river sand, clay, and just enough moisture to hold its shape when squeezed, was her medium now, and she had developed a feel for it that I could not have measured with instruments even if I'd had them. The process was this: pack the green sand around the wooden pattern in a two-part flask, upper and lower, pressing it firm and even in layers, not too hard. Pack it too dense, and the gases the molten iron releases have nowhere to go, and they turn back into voids inside the casting. Not too loose, or the sand collapses when you lift the pattern free. The margin between those two failures was narrow, and Cho Yeong found it by feel every time. "Pack it firm and even," she told the younger workers, pressing her palm flat against the surface of a freshly rammed mold. "Too hard, and the gas can't escape." She lifted her hand, studied the faint impression her palm had left. "Lift the pattern, and the shape just stays." She demonstrated. The two halves of the flask separated. The wooden pattern came free with a careful twist and lift, and there in the green sand was the negative space, the exact hollow the iron would fill. It looked almost nothing like the part. It looked like a wound in the sand, but it was precise, and precision was what mattered. The cores were Cho Yeong's particular pride. Where the mold formed the outside of the casting, the cores formed the inside, baked shapes of sand and binder, set into the mold before the flask was closed, suspended in the iron's path so that when the metal flowed around them it left behind a hollow, a pipe, a chamber, a water passage. Get the cores right, and there was almost no shape we couldn't pour, even the water passages of an engine, when we got there. The thought of it was enough to keep me working past the point where the lamplight made my eyes ache. Sorin arrived on the third morning with her measuring rods and her ledger, and she went straight to Mok's bench without greeting anyone. She picked up one of his patterns and held it against the drawing I had made, a bracket for a machine tool base, simple enough to be a good first casting, complex enough to teach us something. She measured the pattern's length, compared it to the drawing's dimension, and set both down. "Iron shrinks about 1 part in 100, she said, "so Mok carves it that much large, and it cools to true." She opened her ledger and wrote the figure down. "We calculate it, then prove it once." That was the shrinkage allowance, one of the invisible corrections built into every pattern, the gap between what the wood looks like and what the iron will become. Iron is not wood. When it cools from the liquid state it contracts, and if the pattern is made to the final dimension, the casting will come out undersize. Mok had already understood this in principle. Sorin gave him the number, and he carved accordingly. The pattern for the bracket was fractionally, precisely oversized in every dimension. It looked wrong to the eye. It would be right in iron. Sorin recorded everything in her ledger, the sand mixture ratios, the core dimensions, the shrinkage factor, the dates. She did not say it was good or that she was satisfied. She wrote it down, which was the same thing. The pour itself was Tae-ho's moment, and he knew it. He had spent 2 days building up to it, checking the ladle, checking the vents cut into the mold's parting line to let the trapped air escape as the iron rose, checking the sprue and the runners that would carry the metal from the pouring cup down into the mold cavity. He checked them again the morning of the pour. Then he checked them once more. When the iron in the crucible reached temperature, a white-orange brightness that made the air above it shimmer and distort, he lifted the ladle with both hands and positioned himself over the mold with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been burned before and intends never to be burned that way again. Steady pour, he said, not to anyone in particular. Fill from the bottom so the air runs out the vents. The iron came out in a smooth, bright stream, and the sand hissed where the heat touched it. Steam rose from the mold in white billows, carrying the smell of hot clay and something deeper, mineral and sharp. The iron rose in the sprue, visible through the vent holes as a climbing brightness. "Fill, you beauty," Tae-ho said quietly. "Fill every corner." We waited. The iron in the vents told us when the cavity was full, when it rose level in the last vent hole. Tae-ho stopped the pour and stepped back. The mold sat there, steaming, holding its secret. There was nothing to do but wait for it to cool. The breakout was the moment I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Mok Jae was the one who couldn't stand still. He circled the mold while it cooled, hands clasped behind his back, and when Tae-ho finally judged it ready and nodded, Mok was the first one with a rod in his hand, breaking away the sand with short, careful strokes. Come on," he said under his breath, not caring who heard him. "Did it fill? Is it sound?" The sand fell away in chunks and the casting emerged, gray-dark, rough with the texture of the sand, trailing loose grains, and wrong. There was a cold shut along one face where two streams of iron had met and failed to fuse, and on the underside a void, a hollow where the metal had not reached. The shape was there mostly, but the part was not sound. Mok set down his rod. He looked at it for a long moment without speaking. I picked up the casting and turned it in my hands, reading the failure the way the casting wanted to be read. The cold shut told me the iron had cooled too fast on that face, the runner feeding it was too narrow, or the mold had been too cold, or both. The void on the underside told me the venting there was insufficient. The air had been trapped and the iron had nowhere to push it. Both failures had causes. Both causes had corrections. Not bad luck, I said. Bad gating and venting. The casting just told us how to make the next one right. I set it back down. Listen to it. Mok looked at me, then looked at the casting, and I watched him shift from disappointment to something more useful. He picked it up again and turned it the same way I had, reading it. After a moment he nodded once and carried it to his bench. We widened the runner on the cold shut side. We added 2 vent pins to the underside of the cope. We preheated the mold before the second pour. Sorin recorded every change in her ledger. The second pour was quieter than the first. Tae-ho was steadier. The steam rose the same way. The iron climbed the vents the same way. And when Mok broke away the sand the next morning, the casting that emerged was sound. Clean faces, sharp corners, no voids, no cold shuts. He ran his thumb along the edge where the cold shut had been and found only solid iron. Tae-ho stood back and looked at it with his arms crossed and something complicated moving across his face. "We made a shape, Smith," he said, "that no hammer and no lathe could have cut." He shook his head slowly. "Out of sand." A pause. "I'll never get used to it." He was right that no hammer could have made it. The bracket had internal ribs, a recessed channel along its base, and a boss on each end with a cord hole through it. features that would have required hours of machining to produce from bar stock, if they could have been produced at all. We had poured them in one operation. The sand had remembered the shape, and the iron had remembered the sand. The castings that followed over the next days were heavier, machine tool bases, long and thick, with ribbed undersides for stiffness, housings for spindle bearings, a drum for a new water wheel. Each one came out of the sand a little more confidently than the last, as Mok refined his patterns, and Cho Yeong refined her molding, and Tae-ho refined his pour. The loop was becoming visible to me in a way it hadn't been before, not as an idea, but as a physical reality I could walk through. The foundry poured heavy bases. The heavy bases gave the machine tools a steadiness they had never had on their lighter wooden frames, less chatter, truer cuts, closer fits. The truer parts the machine tools now produced fed back into the foundry as better flasks, better core boxes, better pattern-making tools, which meant the next castings were truer, which meant the next machine tools were steadier. Round and round, each turn bigger than the last. I stood in the middle of the foundry floor one evening after the workers had gone and looked at the row of finished castings cooling on the sand, and I thought, this is how it compounds, not by any single breakthrough, but by the loop closing tighter with every revolution. Cho Yeong came at dusk, when the forge fires were banked and the foundry was quiet. She did not come to look at the castings. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and the expression on her face was the one she wore when she was carrying news she had been holding for too long. "They're not coming to tax us now," she said. "They're coming to make an example, so no other dying town gets ideas." The court had declared Iron Ridge a rebel province. The word had come through two separate channels, which meant it was not rumor. They were mustering. How many, she didn't say, but the word she used for the scale of it was not a small word. I looked at the row of castings on the floor, at the ladle hanging on its hook, at the sand still warm from the afternoon's pour. "A foundry that pours iron by the ton," I said, "can pour a great many cannon, Warden. Let them come ready, so will we." She held my gaze for a moment, then nodded once and left. Tae-ho found me still in the foundry an hour later, running my hand along the surface of one of the new bases and thinking about what came next. He had been thinking about it too. I could tell from the way he came in, not to do anything but to say something he'd been working up to. "Cast iron's strong, but it shatters," he said. "For the parts that bend and pound and never quit, that's steel, and steel's always beaten me." He said it plainly, without shame, which was how Tae-ho said most things. Steel had beaten every smith in Iron Ridge. It had beaten smiths in every town I'd passed through. The process was not secret exactly, but it was unreliable, more art than method, more feel than measure, and the results were inconsistent in ways that made the metal untrustworthy for precision work. "Steel is just iron with the carbon tamed to the right amount," I said, "and taming things to the right amount is the one thing this shop does better than anyone alive." He looked at me. He was waiting for the rest of it. "Tomorrow," I said, "we make steel."